The interpretational approach of late Beethoven sonatas for pianists, it's always a mercurial project. It's the sum of the details through the technique which can reach to a certain transcendence of the interpretational reaching of the goals that we assume Beethoven placed in front of us, or for us, not necessarily his, but the ones which we consider to be the measurement for our own civilization of classical music through the meaning, the direction, the thought, as well as the display, as well as the presentation of the fortepiano, which in his time was a new instrument that he was exploring shortly before he became deaf. And when he became deaf, he was exploring it innerly, as all composers imagine things, fantasize things, project things without any boundaries or any obligations to adjust to any kind of instrumental necessities. Rather, through the instrument, convey the purpose, convey the thought, convey the meaning, convey perhaps another genre, instrumental, orchestral, quartet, aria, opera, and in fact, all of the above. There is one thing that specifically is striking me when I teach late Beethoven sonatas is how to define for a student the very context and the texture first, then to define the thematic materials that design it, or that are in fact its nervous system if it was a body, and how we explore it by catching at the end the flair of it rather than only the depiction of it in terms of its construction. I find that necessarily a first step towards a long trip of companionship with the piece for the student ahead during the decades of their lives to come, as performers or teachers in turn, or musicologists, scholars perhaps as well, perhaps both. But the point is that I find it fascinating to be able to be there at the first steps of their discovery, and then imagine the harvest later, way after me. Because these pieces take the time to infuse in you. They keep, every time you will look at them, even if you've studied them, played them, taught them, recorded them, been with them, they reveal themselves differently. Not exactly by the detail, perhaps, but more about the general organization. So to start with specifics, what I like to address is, for instance, a sonata is Opus 110. He starts string quartet. Then it mutates into an aria. this aria went to these arpeggios. These arpeggios are like harp, possibly pianistic virtuosity, going for different ranges of arpeggios, with the left hand suggestive of the theme of the quartet. And it's only in the recapitulation that we'll have together the melodic line of the quartet with the harp arpeggiations. It together after he gave it to us relatively mysteriously in separate elements, up to us to combine them. He doesn't give it out in an explanative way. Chopin, the first ballade, suggests in the introduction this hanging supernatural, I would say. Appoggiatura. And then it's only at the second page, when he has a variation of it, that he finishes the exposition. As if to explain what he purposely left sort of enigmatic, hanging. Beethoven. Gives us to understand this after we only heard separately. And this is separate quartet. The quartet writing in Beethoven is something haunting him for all almost piano sonatas of his. Would be something like his necessarily inner language of expression. So his mother tongue would be string quartet. And could be a symphony, could be an overture, or could be a sonata, a piano trio, but even piano trio is a quartet with the two hands of the piano being two parts at least, with the other two instruments. So he's obsessed with this in beautiful ways for us until the big fugue late in his life, where he goes quasi-atonal, quasi. But to keep on the project of the late sonatas for the understanding of the context for the interpretation, I like to think that Opus 109 also starts as a quartet. It's with a melodic line, outlined with upper steps, and arpeggiated harmonization, which reveals the harmonization as a coating when the melody is hanging. And if you think about it, played as a quartet, at least as a harmony 4-part exercise, you would do this. And I suggest to do the same when you start the beginning of the other sonata of the late period, Opus 101. In this case, he uses the string quartet literally linear. Second violin, first violin, arpeggiato tonic, which happens to be the dominant since we're in A major. But that we don't know until we hear later the piece. But he establishes it in this texture in 110 we just heard. So if I take out the rhythmicity of the opening of 110, I just do the harmonic progression. The harmonic progression of 101. The linear flow, the harmonic progression, the essence before the coating, and in 109 with the arpeggiato. In the three cases of 101, 109, and 110, he starts with a slow or moderate movement that is followed by a very drastically contrasting either second half of a larger number, if you want to think of the structure as this binom, or as a second movement connected or at least close to being in the flow of the first, and it becomes the tension towards the release. For instance, in 101, the maestoso dotted rhythm French overture in the bifocal modulation of common tone, A, tonic, or F major, third. Common tone modulation for most people. And then in 109, he goes in minor for the prestissimo. Whenever in 110, he goes in the allegro. And in this case, F major is the relative minor, so the common tone is, of course, the third and the root. And in 109, it was major in minor, so the common tone is the root and the fifth. In both cases, he's already breaking with the tradition of the recently established Haydn sonata form, fast, slow, fast, or fast, slow, minuet, fast. And beyond all this formal evolution, I wonder if there is something in this idea of the thought. He gives us to start the piece not with a thematic display of a formal elegance like in the earlier sonatas. We know what's about. Everything is defined. Rhythm, tonality, thematic material, even range. And a suggestion through the rests also in between, during which I speak, I'm sorry. I shouldn't. He defines also the elegance of the mood. In the earlier one, you the thematic material, the mood, the atmosphere, the operatic style overture that sets the ingredients of the whole piece to develop through the different transitions into second themes or reusing the first theme as a second theme. All his techniques of developing from a simple, mundane thematic material into a grand piece. That is his development thinking process. And in the late sonatas, he seems to not be interested in being convincing by the elegance of the form or the charm of the mood. He goes directly for the thought. And that makes it very difficult to be played, because in that sense, a thought is something which is within, not something to be expressed. Sehnsucht, as the Germans say, see within. And so you have to find a way to express them with the right tone of expression, mezzo forte, mezzo piano, voiced but not too much, and convey in the opening of 110 that we started with the outer two lines. If it was cello and violin, and then viola second violin. The inner two voices, so to say, sandwich between this thematic material of the ascending fourths by step, which will become the subject of his fugue from Bach's A major. Or just because it's fourths up by step. Sequence. But you see, that's the thing about the filiation within pieces. Did they hear it? Did they know it? Did they think about it? Regardless how much that was a willing quotation or imitation or just being in the lineage of. It is striking for us to know, because it helps for the informed performer to understand better the context of things, how they were born and how they became to blossom to what they are. And outside of its context, today we have to replunge within it to understand how and what we can bring without to be too forceful in our interpretation, letting the listener discover the context and, of course, the storytelling. It's a delicate balance for the interpreter, who is no more the composer by essence, since he's dead, not to substitute to the composer while playing, but to suggest the thought process through the playing in a subtle way of voicing this or bringing that, the pulse, the rhythm versus the melodic line and the harmonic organization. It's not one or the other, it's a subtle combination of all. And it brings you to think, in fact, I have to convey the music itself without to overimpose my comment musically over it. But to a certain extent, I am involved when I play it. And nobody would ask Beethoven if his interpretation, if he played it, when he played it, was correct. Of course, it was his. He was not right or wrong. But that doesn't mean it's exclusive. After all, others can see things in it, perhaps even differently for sure, but not necessarily. If I stick with it, I can say that there is also this element in the late sonatas of fragmentation that students have very often difficulty understanding, as if everything is not just a flow of consequences from one section to the next, a developmental transformation through variations or through imitations or through thematic chopping of elements and then demonstratively placing them, some kind of a beautiful dish of tastes for the different materials that will combine in one or the other way. So yes, it's like attending the cooking session of a cook while also tasting the result. But not everybody does the same results at the end from the cookbook's same recipe. That's what comes out from the score, how we read or what we misread or how we want to be reading it. For instance, when he has this interruption after the arpeggioso, and then he re-interrupts. A return of the string quartet with imitation. Like, it doesn't indicate to bring it back in the bass. I do, because that's my added, I would say, loving voicing. Do I have the ethical right to impose my loving voicing if it's not in the score? Can I justify it analytically, or just by the fact that I love it, or I think it brings a certain connection to the thought process? After all, even without the imitation is beautiful. It's just there to be, in fact, perhaps discovered by the listener. Of course, you don't have the score when you listen, or if you did have it, you don't have it during the performance. So the performer, in a way, guides you through more or less subtle voicing. But I'm not sure that it's necessarily wrong to give students, especially graduate students, the option to choose, after all, ultimately what they'll filter through all this information they get from the score itself, through the teacher's suggestion and examples, and then imagination, and how they build their own construction of what is essential and what is less essential. After all, this hierarchy has to be made perhaps through the time that the piece takes itself, the need to sort of sink in our psyche or subconscious. And I think that these interruptions, these fragmentations, I could organize in a way that could help the student to suggest that this is a symphonic work with orchestration. And we have woodwinds, brass, strings, or combinations of thereof, and there is one transformation of the timbre to another. And in this case, for the fortepiano, with straight strings from higher register to medium to the brassy lower, and then eventually the very heartwarming strings. And then the modern piano being cross-strung, the strings resonate by sympathy, and therefore we have a homogeneity that is the design of the modern piano through the ranges of its 88 keys. Nevertheless, on the fortepiano there were straight strung parallel, and they had really different compartimented timbre colors, like in an orchestra, and therefore in the fortepiano you obtain that more obviously. The thinness of the one, like oboe or clarinet, and then a little more chord to the sound with French horn and perhaps some brass, and then the warmth of the strings, depending on how they're displayed in the orchestral disposition on the piano. In fact, there is a continuum of the thought process of the composer, but different musicians or group of musicians play it alternatively in the orchestra in the succession where it's written. Whenever the pianist, being the sole performer, tends to search for a logical connection in the thought process development, but there isn't. And that's probably what is beautiful about this kind of enigmatic, I call it, opening movements of these late sonatas, where he goes through thought processes that are not all completed, let less by a climax, just not even the punctuation. Sometimes they're just interrupted and he immediately goes to something else. And the performer has to dare, not around the angles, to try to give the illusion or the impression or the perhaps false necessity to make a sense out of this that appears to be just patched groups of elements, like a fantasy, while it's called a sonata. Well, there is a form, and there are themes, and there are transitions, and there are modulations. So it's a very delicate balance when you teach to not overstate the importance of the structure versus the detail, and not erase the obvious in bringing out what is there to be essential in each of those fragments. For instance, after this section comes struggle of 2 against 2 by phrasing of the beat in exponential expansion and going into different ranges of extreme, and then returning in the center in the string quartet. And in between you have this empty rest. Well, rather a very intense rest. And that capacity of reflection, of echo, resonance in the rests of what was just said like a scream, and then regroup in the center as a conclusion in string quartet texture. Universality of the piano as an instrument, the modern piano, is that in fact it taints a bit by its pianism everything you play on it, from Baroque to jazz to romantic to contemporary. On the other hand, the instruments for which pieces were played, composed on, etc., can bring us exactly the sound timbre that the composers thought or heard, but they can't be universal either, because they mostly lock you to the repertoire that they can give. That's like they talk to you and say, this is what I can give you in this repetition speed of the action of a note, and this articulation, and this pedalization, and so on. So in a way, the piano is perhaps traitor, betrayer to all of the styles, except that you can play in a given recital a little of everything from centuries around, as long as you have the taste to stylistically define them in frames of dynamic ranges, colors, or define rubato and quality of expression, of emotion, of lyricism, at which point a voicing, a phrasing will become 4 and 2, or 5 slur into it. And how do you play the repeated notes melodic? By repeating them within the expressive, non-fully relieved up key. And you replay it halfway up. Ta 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 becomes ta. And these indicible words of lyrics that don't exist but that are so suggestive through the writing, even melodically, of repeated notes. It's a term of endearment or an appoggiatura with anticipation, regardless how you call it. It is not, or. So he chose not to play the step motion, natural legato expectation on the piano as a writing, after all, for the piano, but the syllabic repetition of a note where you change the syllable versus, unless you have two consonants, ta 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 pa ta, and if it's a continuous vocalise, he's barely prolonging it rather than restriking it fully. And then this way the decay is defeated for the resonance. You restrike it halfway in, which means that then you can have the illusion that this instrument, based on decaying sound after it's hit on the vibration of the string by the hammer in this resonant chamber. So if you have the accompaniment in 30 seconds, or the Albertine sixteenths, then you can zoom more deeply into how it's written by observing the score, and then how you can bring it in the playing to be alive, not only theoretical. The opening is a dotted quarter, eighth note, then a dotted eighth, and a 16th. De facto, it's a rhythmic accelerando. We have a long value, a medial value, a shorter value, and the shortest value to escape to the next downbeat. In Schumann's Fantasy, dedicated in part to Beethoven, he has with the syncopation quarter eighth tied to the faster syncopation 16th 8/16, and then the 32nd on the top. It's kind of written accelerando is here too. So if to count it, subdivide it 1 2 3 4 2 2 3 4 3 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 2 to secure that it's integrity of the rhythmic pattern within the pulse. But then you play it as a melodic line. Tension, release. Tension, release. It's not only that, but it's also that. So I think the best is to coat it within and let it appear as if you don't count, but you only feel the textures and the lengths and the shortnesses of the patterns of the rhythmic elements. Through, with the rhythm, with the repeated notes and the dotted rhythm, and you feel like by repeating and practicing this way in the construction from the root up of the elements, adding them one after the other, the piece appears. All these choices of the composer appear in resonances, not only in theoretical facts on a document from which we retrieve it to. We give it life one more time, as many did before us from the text, and many will do after us from the same text. And perhaps we'll all see different things in tempo, since the metronome marketed by Melzel didn't reach these late sonatas in Beethoven's markings other than for the symphonies in the late years of his life in Vienna. We can still stay at a certain point where we can define ourselves the pace according to the structure. If this is a quarter, this is an eighth, and I'm going to have 30 seconds. The long values have to be absorbing the short values so that we have a structure to the point to which when we finish, the 3-2 pattern of the Hemiola, 1, 2, 3, for the third beat being a rest of half notes, and then 1, 2, 3. In my imagination becomes the value for the two groups of the 4/4 bars of the Allegro. But the meter of the first movement is 3/4. 1, 2, 3, therefore by quarter notes. And if you count in quarter notes the ending, which finishes sort of without purposely having a closing, 1, 2, 3, in quarter notes, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then so finishes on the 10th, not on the tonic, let less on the downbeat, no closure, but open 10th, which is in fact the 5th of the F minor. Now he doesn't say attacca per se that it has to be connected or in a resonance, but I wonder always. Same way by the end of 109, before he goes to the prestissimo. He still has that hanging offbeat major triad, and he starts with a minor third. In the resonance of it, not exactly stricken together, obviously. As usual, when I try to prove a point, the example goes out of the context of the reality of how things, in fact, subtly evolve from this. But during a fraction of a second, nevertheless, you have that. Was not obviously the intention, but he didn't avoid it either. He could have with a simple fifth, and then instead of finishing in major, and then it's true that his choices are logical for some analysts, surprising for performers who think that sometimes this spontaneity of his writing, away from the early style of the form, freed from all kinds of rules, allows him just to go for the essence. He does the same in 101. So the major third for A major, and the C sharp, and the C natural, in resonance from distant, depending how long you take between the movements. Now in the 109 they collide differently because it's major and minor. And they have two thin lines rather than one thick to demonstrate usually the conclusiveness of a movement versus a section with two lines. That would be more like semi-comma or so in punctuation text. But is that really so clear? In the sense, did he want them to be connecting? Did he want them not? Perhaps he let it to us. And for us, outside of the context of his time, we have to study a lot to learn how to replunge ourselves in what was done then. to know what to do today. But we don't play it with the same ears, let less patiences for repeats or redundancies, which are part of the essence of the style, or fragmentations, as he broke with the tradition of his earlier style, which he received from this tradition of the Viennese school. And the instrument is different, but the essence of the intervals, the essence of the tension releases of the harmonic projections, the suspensions, the endings, the delay endings, like in the German language syntax, where the verb is at the end and the action, therefore you're in a suspenseful expectation to know if it's present, past, or future, if it's a captivating storytelling. And that certainly is in the case of these works, be it enigmatic, but captivating perhaps because of it. And regardless of how they are famous among pianists. But ultimately, we have to rediscover it from the essence of the score, from the manuscript, from the editions, from not only how other people play them, because it's the visible part of the iceberg. We want to go into the roots and understand. For instance, at the end section of 109, he refuses to continue the arpeggios. He only reduces it to the chordal offbeat together. The harmonization, which finishes with a cadence in E major, 5 of 5, 2 consecutive, 1 secondary dominant of the dominant, and the dominant itself in E major. And you can see in the manuscript that he has added with thicker ink a suspension of the C sharp to B, but then it's too large for the A natural to grab in one hand. Therefore, he had to bring the dominant 7th A natural in the left hand. And you can see that in the larger stroke of the ink of his hand. And then he adds a passing tone. So from a simple chordal 5 of 5, you can see by the different thickness of the added layers of ink, becoming ultimately this is a detail, it's a transition, it's a cadential pattern. It's not dramatically the most special, I would say, but everything has a meaning in the way it's placed, in the display, in the ranges, in the harmonic progression. It's intrigued me as a child already, but it took me a long time to figure out somehow an explanation, because I was bothered that in this passing tone, because of in fact what I discovered later was the large display in the right hand, he had to rise the 7th melodically when normally the 7th closes to the 3rd of the tonic, and not, which is perhaps scholastic unnecessarily, but factually the voice leading is not just a theory thing for learning how to write 4 parts writing or so in the exercise of a music theory class. It's to apply it in real time in your GPS reading of the thought of the composer and how each element contributes to a connection or even a disconnection. And I realized that it's just the display of the right hand that, being too large, obliged him to take it in the left hand. And he didn't shy from doing this rising dominant 7th. Of course, it's not an exercise, and he's in his right to be transgressive in the voice leading, and he is. And the purpose of it is way bigger than that. The purpose is the statement. The purpose is the thought. The purpose is what is a secondary dominant to the principal dominant. How do we delay it until we resolve it? which is why I mentioned the German language with the syntax and the verb at the end of the sentence. So we are in an expectation rather than just... And that can be multiplied in many sections, where you can see that there is a way of delaying the resolution to create a sense of bringing it further. And the more I try to explain, I don't reach any clarity of conclusion of the why and the because of the how. It's more about shaping the question rather than expecting the answer. In a way, clarifying the understanding of what you try to reach. It's left to you afterwards in your playing to do. After all, you play through your music playing, not through your music explanations. But you have to explain things in words to a student. And I try so much to find the right balance between information and then affirmation, and then bringing out the essence of what I think is necessarily important, but without to hierarchize in a way that is pervasive. After all, the students make their own, it's more than opinion, their own inner world of all that, how things connect. And I find that in the late sonatas by Beethoven, one finds so much food for thought for one's own yearning and search, and it's literally God's gift to pianists, because very little is explained in the composer's text. A lot is in the hint, in the suggestion, and it's up to you to find the elegant way when you play to bring these proportions in your imaginary reconstruction of it, as if for an ephemeral moment it becomes alive through your own connecting dots. Lifelong yearning.